Chapter 1. Early Life of the Dictator. Nicolae Ceausescu was born on January 26, 1918, in the poor village of Scornicesti in southern Romania. He was the third of 10 children in a peasant family that struggled to feed itself. His father was harsh, his mother exhausted, and the boy grew up in a home where hunger was constant and education was a luxury. Nicolae's formal schooling stopped after the 3rd grade. He learned instead from labor in the fields and the tough streets of the capital. At the age of 11, he fled for Bucharest, where he worked as a shoemaker's apprentice. In the capital, young Nicolae discovered the Romanian Communist Party, which was at the time an illegal underground movement. He was restless, angry at authority, and drawn to the promises of equality that communism preached. By his teens, he had already been arrested for distributing leaflets. By his early 20s, he had spent long months in prison. These early arrests gave him a taste of state violence, beatings, cold cells, and endless interrogations. But they also gave him a kind of education. He learned how to stay silent under questioning, how to keep secrets, and above all, how to obey orders without hesitation. What he lacked in intelligence, he made up for in loyalty. And in the violent world of Romanian politics, loyalty to the party was a more valuable currency than books or ideas. Chapter 2. The Rise to Power. After the Second World War, Romania fell into the Soviet sphere. The Red Army and local communists crushed opposition and installed a new regime. Ceausescu's years of loyalty were rewarded. He moved steadily up the ladder, first a youth organizer, then a bureaucrat in agriculture, then a deputy minister of defense. He was never a brilliant thinker, never an inspiring speaker, but he was trusted to obey, trusted to carry out orders with cold efficiency. He shadowed Gheorghe Gheorghiu Dej, the Romanian communist leader who had survived Stalin's purges. By attaching himself to Dej, Nicolae ensured his own survival. When Dej died in March of 1965, Ceausescu maneuvered himself into the role of first secretary of the Romanian Communist Party. At first, he looked like a new kind of leader. He was younger, energetic, and spoke of reform. He even won applause from the West when, in 1968, he denounced the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. Western leaders mistook him for a maverick. Nixon visited. De Gaulle praised him. Queen Elizabeth hosted him in London. For a moment, Romania appeared to stand apart from Moscow's shadow. But inside Romania, something else was happening. Ministries were being stripped of independence. The party was gathering every lever of power. A secret police machine was expanding. And at the very top sat Nicolae Ceausescu, a man who had learned early that survival means control, and control means fear. The mask of reformer was already cracking. The brutal dictator was about to reveal himself. Chapter 3. The Cult of Personality. Nicolae Ceausescu did not want to be a leader among leaders. He wanted to be a presence that filled the sky of public life. After 1965, he moved fast to centralize authority, but the decisive turn came in 1971 when he returned from visits to China and North Korea, determined to convert the whole of Romanian culture into a mirror that reflected only himself and his wife, Elena. The July theses he announced that summer were not a set of suggestions. They were a command to bend schools, universities, publishing houses, theaters, film studios, scientific academies, and the broadcast system to the single task of glorifying the party and the first secretary. From that moment, the country was asked not merely to obey, it was asked to adore. The machinery was relentless. Editors learned that the front page had one purpose: to reproduce the words of the leader and to wrap those words in a vocabulary of triumph. The news became an hourly hymn. Radio programs opened with recordings of his speeches and closed with the same recordings, as if the day could not begin or end without his voice. Television was cut to 2 hours each evening, and those hours were crowded with visits to factories and collective farms, where the cameras lingered on his gestures. The lifted hand, the paternal touch on a child's cheek, the nod that signaled wisdom. If a worker spoke on camera, the phrases were memorized in advance. If a peasant appeared on screen, the basket of bread and salt had been placed and rehearsed. Nothing was spontaneous, because spontaneity could admit reality. Titles multiplied until they lost meaning and became a kind of sound effect. He was described as the genius of the Carpathians, the Danube of thought, the architect of modern socialism, the father of the nation, the guarantor of peace. Elena was raised with him, called a great scientist, placed at the top of academies, awarded medals and doctorates in ceremonies that demanded enthusiasm. Professors understood that even a moment of hesitation while clapping could be read as disloyalty. Institutions that once guarded standards learned to guard the leader's pride. The school system became a pipeline of ritual. In kindergartens, children repeated chants that paired the name Nicolae with the name Elena, as if they were parents of every child in the room. In primary classes, the poems were longer and the imagery heavier. The leader compared to mountains, to rivers, to the sun. Mathematics textbooks used harvest targets and production quotas as example numbers. Chemistry courses opened with quotations credited to Elena's supposed research. Inspectors arrived not to evaluate learning, but to count the rhythm of applause and the precision of slogans. Teachers rehearsed classes for days before a visit, because a single misstep could ruin a career. Adults were drawn into the same theater. Factories were ordered to send whole shifts to stadiums for mass rallies. University staff received quotas for how many people they needed to deliver to parades. Portraits were issued by the crate and had to be displayed at the correct height and angle. Managers kept lists of who clapped first and who clapped last. Work units practiced responses to the cues of a master of ceremonies, so that cheers would surge and fall at the right moments for the television cameras. The leadership pretended this was devotion. Everyone understood it was choreography enforced by fear. Culture narrowed until it resembled a procession. Theater seasons were rewritten to include patriotic spectacles. Film scripts were cut and cut again until only cheerful workers and benevolent officials remained on screen. Painters and sculptors repeated the same heroic profile of the couple. Writers learned to censor themselves before the censor touched the page, because it was safer to erase a line in private than to be called to an office and asked to explain irony. Scholars rephrased papers to insert tributes at the opening paragraph. Even technical congresses began with oaths of loyalty. Architecture was yoked to the cult. Bucharest's map was altered to create axial views and grand boulevards for parades. Whole districts that carried the memory of generations were marked for demolition because they spoiled the perspective toward the future palace. Churches that stood in the way were pushed aside on rails or leveled. The city was staged like a set in which the couple would play the leading roles for as long as they wanted. The built environment ceased to be a home and became a backdrop. By the 1980s, the scale of manufactured adoration was measurable in tonnage and miles. Millions of portraits were printed every year, enough that a classroom could display 3 and a corridor 5, and an office at least 1. Banners stretched across streets for congresses and anniversaries, and each banner required hours on ladders and rolls of cloth that elsewhere could have been shirts or sheets. Birthday celebrations consumed weeks of rehearsal. On his 70th birthday, tens of thousands stood in a stadium under a summer sun while cameras swept across the crowd to capture the angles of the cheering faces. Entire institutions sent gifts that no one needed, books bound in velvet, medallions struck in workshops that otherwise could have been making useful parts. The cult reached beyond event and image into language and memory. Textbooks rewrote the national past so that medieval rulers appeared as precursors of Ceausescu's virtues. Museums rearranged galleries so that the final room contained a portrait of the couple, as if all centuries poured into their hands. Scornicesti, his birthplace, was described in catechisms as a village of destiny. Children were taken there by bus to view sights that had been polished for the camera rather than preserved for the truth. Admiration enforced by punishment creates a special kind of silence. People learn to smile on command and to erase their own thoughts before a sentence left their mouth. They placed the portrait in the living room because not placing it could bring the Securitate. They applauded because stillness could be read as treason. In this way, the cult did not only inflate the leader, it shrank the citizen. A person who must pretend all day becomes smaller inside. A society full of smaller inner lives becomes easier to govern by intimidation. That result, more than any slogan, explains why the cult of personality stood at the core of the dictatorship. It was not a decoration, it was the operating system. Chapter 4. The Secret Police and the Geography of Fear. The apparatus that made the cult lethal was the Securitate. Romania under Ceausescu was not merely watched, it was mapped in fear. The service recruited across professions, across neighborhoods, and across families. An informer could be the caretaker of a stairwell, a colleague at a drafting table, a cousin who needed a favor that only the state could grant. Files were opened with a number and a code name, and expanded with notes taken in small rooms that smelled of cigarettes and glue. The purpose was to dissolve trust. If you did not know who reported, you learned to speak as if every person reported it. Communication was penetrated methodically. Letters were diverted to centers where trained hands steamed and resealed them, and there placed stamps with matching stamps so that only a chemical trace remained of the intrusion. Telephone exchanges held switchboards that allowed silent listening. Apartments were searched while families were at work. Like a book moved a finger's breadth on a shelf. A photograph placed slightly crooked on a dresser. A reminder that a key you thought you controlled had no meaning. Radios set to foreign stations drew attention. A postcard from abroad could start a file. Arrest usually began as a hand on the elbow and a car door. Interrogation relied on a mixture of confusion and exhaustion. Lights burned into eyes for hours, then the lights were turned off, and the silence was used as a second weapon. Food was minimal and irregular. Questions repeated until time collapsed, and the difference between yesterday and today was only the temperature of the room. Statements were written and rewritten until they matched the needs of the interrogator. The goal was not information. The goal was submission written on paper. Prisons carried names that still cause a tightening of the chest among those who remember them. Chilava with its damp cells, Aiud with its long corridors, Râmnicu Scarot with its isolation rules that kept voices from touching each other. Men and women were beaten with sticks and belts and fists. Ribs cracked, teeth loosened, joints swelled. Doctors who might have treated the damage worked for the same institution that had caused it. Years vanished in those buildings. And when a prisoner emerged, if a prisoner emerged, the person who walked through the gate moved carefully for the rest of a life. The Securitate used methods that avoided bruises as well. Dissidents noticed the same faces behind them on different streets. Anonymous calls arrived at night, in which a voice recited an address and a schedule for a child, and then hung up. Employers learned that a worker had been found unreliable, and that it would be patriotic to let him go. Landlords learned that a family was no longer entitled to an apartment. Pets died from poison. Marriages were split with rumors planted by careful phone calls and chance encounters that were not chance. A person could be ruined without an arrest. This was deliberate. It taught millions to choose silence long before a cell door could close. Examples filled the 80s. The engineer Gheorghe Gheorghiu kept a diary that criticized the leader. He was arrested in 1985, charged not with political crimes, but with currency infractions, beaten in a Bucharest jail, and died of his injuries. The classification of the case was the point, to show that the state could disguise punishment as common law. Writers who signed letters to foreign broadcasters found relatives called in for questioning. Pastors who defended their parishioners found themselves moved to remote villages. Students who organized quietly discovered that graduation required cooperation with the service. Exit visas were withheld to discipline those with relatives abroad. Border guards maintained lists of names to be stopped and questioned without explanation. The scale of surveillance is difficult to fix precisely because archives are incomplete. Yet even cautious analysts agree that hundreds of thousands served as informers at one time or another. Tens of thousands passed through detention because of political reasons. The numbers matter, and yet they cannot measure the distance that fear traveled in a single day. When a society learns to weigh every sentence in their mouth before it emerges, when people rehearse silence as if it were a profession, the damage cannot be counted only in injuries and graves. It must also be counted in lost friendships, in unspoken ideas, in children who grew up watching their parents lower their voices when the doorbell rang. Chapter 5. Decree 770. The War on Women and the Making of Orphanages in 1966. The dictatorship enacted Decree 770. It outlawed almost all abortions and restricted contraception to the point that it all but vanished for ordinary families. The stated purpose was to increase the population, to make the nation stronger through numbers. The practical purpose was discipline. By seizing control of reproduction, the state seized control of the intimate timetable of homes, workplaces organized monthly, examinations for women of childbearing age. Doctors became officers of surveillance. Pregnancy was recorded in ledgers as if it were a quota to be met. Miscarriages were treated as suspect. Women were questioned in hospital rooms about the most private actions, and nurses learned to report answers. Physicians who helped a patient quietly could lose their license, their freedom, and sometimes their health at the hands of interrogators. In this way, a law reached into bedrooms and made every mother a subject of paperwork. The effects were immediate and cruel. When safe abortion is forbidden, it does not stop. It becomes unsafe. Women resorted to knitting needles, to chemical mixtures, to poorly trained operators in rooms that were never clean. Hemorrhage and infection followed. Maternal mortality rose. Conservative estimates count thousands of women who died over the following decades because the law removed safe options. A death like that does not end in a statistic. It ends in a kitchen where a child is told that the mother is not coming home, and in a factory where a co-worker says nothing because to ask a question might bring the police. The decree collided with austerity in the 1980s to produce another tragedy: the expansion of state orphanages. Families who could barely afford bread were told to raise more children. Tens of thousands of infants and toddlers were abandoned to institutions that promised care and delivered neglect. The world saw the ruins after 1989. Metal cribs placed end to end, children with shaved heads staring at the ceiling, bottle-propped feedings because there were not enough hands, scabies and lice and diarrhea untreated for weeks. The rocking motion of self-soothing that develops in children who are not held. The names of places like Siray and Sayed became shorthand for a system that had converted policy into a field of suffering. The damage extended to those who survived. Malnutrition during infancy left cognitive scars. Lack of attachment left emotional scars. The transition after the revolution brought another wave of harm as institutions struggled to reform and as international adoption networks moved faster than regulators. A generation known in Romania as the Decretae, those born after the decree, grew up carrying the weight of a choice they did not make. Many did well. Many struggled. All were shaped by a law written to satisfy a dictator's vision of national strength. Decree 770 is central to any honest account of the dictatorship because it reveals the method. Ceausescu did not only command adults to clap, he commanded women to bear children for a state that could not feed them and would not love them. He turned the private moral decision of a family into a public legal trap. He turned doctors into reluctant wardens. He turned infants into numbers that proved his theory. If one seeks the meaning of tyranny, one can find it in a hospital corridor where a woman is watched by a nurse with a form in her hand and a policeman waiting at the end of the hall. Chapter 6: Hunger, Austerity, and Darkness. The 1980s in Romania can be described in 3 words: hunger, cold, and dark. They were produced by a decision taken at the top to repay foreign debt rapidly and publicly, and by a pride that refused to admit that a policy could be cruel, even if it was efficient. The debt was paid. The price was terrible. Food was rationed. Bread rations were set. Sugar and oil rations were set, and meat became a luxury. People queued before dawn at bakeries and butcher shops. The line itself became a daily institution with rules and hierarchies and rumors. Someone knew someone who knew a clerk who might hold a loaf behind the counter. Someone had a cousin who could bring a kilogram of flour from a rural district. Someone had a jar of preserved vegetables to trade for a piece of pork. Every household developed a map of the city that connected potential sources of calories. Children learned to count, not with toys, but with ration coupons. Fuel was scarce. Gasoline coupons limited travel to a few liters a month. Streets emptied after sunset because no one wanted to waste a trip and because buses were unreliable and trains slow. Electricity was cut according to schedules that served export contracts first. Elevators sat still. Refrigerators warmed and cooled in destructive cycles. Houses and apartments were kept at temperatures that the leadership called healthy and that the population called miserable. windows iced on the inside. Grandparents kept gloves on while they sat at kitchen tables. Winter was the long season. Hospitals proved the indecency of slogans about victory through sacrifice. Doctors asked families to bring soap and gauze and syringes because the wards had none to supply. Surgeons operated without adequate anesthesia. Pharmacies displayed empty shelves and long faces. Diseases that modern systems had learned to manage returned. Tuberculosis surged. Infant mortality rose compared with earlier years. Life expectancy stalled when it should have grown. These are not arguments. They are measurements. The cultural effects were as deep as the physical ones. When a person spends hours in queues and hours in darkness, there is less time to read and to think, less patience to argue, less energy to imagine. The 2-hour television window each evening, filled with speeches and praise, replaced art and analysis with monotony. The greatest theft of austerity may have been the theft of time. Citizens were made to spend their days pursuing goods that any decent state would have delivered as a matter of course. Then they were made to watch a program that told them that the pursuit was success. In 1989, Ceausescu announced that Romania had extinguished its foreign debt. He stood on a platform and declared a triumph. History will record that he was right on the narrow point and wrong on the only point that mattered. A state that measures its virtue by the ledger while its people shiver and bury children has confused arithmetic with morality. The economy is a means to human life, not the other way around. That lesson was paid in funerals. Chapter 7. Systematization, demolition of streets, and the rise of a palace, the same impulse that demanded applause and obedience, demanded a new map. Systematization was presented as scientific planning for a modern society. It treated villages as errors to be corrected and neighborhoods as obstacles to straight lines. The countryside was slated for consolidation into agricultural towns where peasants would live in standardized blocks and commute to fields organized according to charts. The traditions that had allowed families to survive for centuries, kitchen gardens, hen houses, small orchards, informal exchange networks, were dismissed as backward. People were moved as if they were columns in a table. Bucharest became the central exhibit of this vision. The demolition of the Uranus Quarter made room for a new civic center, a ceremonial boulevard, and the House of the People. Streets that curved and paused and created small squares were wiped out and replaced with wide avenues meant for military parades and camera trucks. The churches of Antum and Macelar were shifted with engineering ingenuity that deserved a nobler purpose. Hundreds of buildings with stories carved into their door frames, and their stair rails were flattened. The sound of a neighborhood is made by its residents. In those years, the sound was bulldozers. The House of the People rose as a statement that dwarfed everything around it. Its footprint is enormous. Its interior is a sequence of halls and staircases that actually cause disorientation because they repeat and repeat. Marble-clad surfaces that never needed marble. Chandeliers sparkle above rooms that were rarely used. Carpets cover spaces so large that they could have been counted as fields. The labor required to build it came from citizens whose apartments were kept cold and whose hospitals were kept bare. Every meter of stone in that building is an argument, and the argument is that one person's vanity outweighed the comfort of millions. The rural program cut village life into shapes that did not fit the past or the present. People who moved into blocks lost the rhythms that had sustained them, the small economies of neighborly exchange, and the dignity of tending land at the edge of a yard. The new units were supposed to be efficient. They were actually alienating. A plan that erases the memory embedded in streets and houses is a plan that gambles with the social bonds that make law and neighborliness possible. Systematization damaged those bonds and claimed that damage is progress. Urbanists and architects who objected were sidelined. Clergy who appealed for the preservation of churches learned to accept the terms of the state or to move. Historians watched buildings that contained layers of identity disappear in afternoons. A city is a story written in brick and stone and shadow. The dictatorship tore out chapters and replaced them with a slogan. Chapter 8: Crushing Dissent. Punishment as policy and the arithmetic of victims. A system built on compulsory praise cannot endure unpunished contradiction. The dictatorship treated dissent as an infection to be cut out. It did not matter whether the voice came from a mine shaft, a factory floor, a university office, a pulpit, or a small gathering around a kitchen table. The response was calibrated to intimidate the speaker and everyone listening. The Jew Valley Strike in 1977 remains an early landmark. Miners demanded pay and conditions that reflected the danger and dignity of their work. The state met them first with gestures that looked like negotiation, and then with a campaign of arrests, interrogations, and forced relocations. Leaders were pulled from beds at night and driven through towns with curtains drawn in the cars, as if secrecy could erase the echoes of their names. The method taught every workplace a lesson. Organize openly, and you will be organized by the police. Writers who appealed to human rights discovered that paper can cut flesh. Paul Goma's letters in the late 1970s placed him under constant surveillance and led to beatings and exile. The Professor Doina Cornea in Cluj wrote messages that called for dignity and paid with house arrest, with the cutting of telephone lines, with interrogations that sought to isolate her voice until it sounded like a whisper. The poet Mircea Dinescu criticized the system in 1989 and found himself confined to his apartment while the country discussed him in private. Priests who defended parishioners were transferred to remote parishes and warned that every sermon would be read like a case file. The Brasov Revolt in November 1987 revealed the depth of anger among workers. When prices rose and shortages deepened, a procession began that grew into a march and then into an assault on party headquarters. Portraits of the leader were toppled, torn, and burned. The images traveled quickly by rumor and more slowly by foreign radio. The reaction was swift. Arrests in the hundreds, beatings in basements, forced signatures on confessions that prosecutors would later hold up as justice, evictions that uprooted families in hours, expulsions from schools that punished children for the courage of parents. The point was not to discover truth. The point was to broadcast fear. Specific names marked the cruelty of the time. The engineer Gheorghe Gheorghiu died after beatings in custody in 1985. The context of his death confirmed what many already understood, that the state would disguise political punishment with ordinary charges and would let a man bleed while officials filled forms with neutral language. The pastor Laszlo Tokes in Timisoara faced harassment and eviction in 1989 because he spoke against injustice. The attempt to remove him lit protests that became the revolution. These names are not exceptions. They are points on a line that runs through the years of the 80s. How many died? How many were broken? How many lived for decades with the taste of interrogation in their mouths? Precise numbers are contested because records were manipulated and destroyed. Because the state hid its wounds, and because many deaths were indirect, the result of policy rather than bullets. It is honest to say thousands died in prisons, labor facilities, and crackdowns across the communist decades. It is honest to say that the austerity years added thousands more deaths that did not have to occur. Deaths in wards without medicines, deaths in apartments without heat, deaths that followed malnutrition and infection. It is certain that in December 1989, alone roughly 1,000 people were killed and several thousand wounded in the uprising that ended the dictatorship. The arithmetic of victims does not end with those who stopped breathing. The arithmetic also includes the millions who lived under permanent threat and the children whose bodies and minds were stunted by policy. Punishment was a policy because fear was a policy. The dictatorship did not need to persuade when it could frighten. It did not need to argue when it could isolate. It did not need to win hearts when it could count signatures on forms that promised silence. The country became a place where the safest word was yes, and the safest gesture was applause. The truth that grew under that pressure was simple. A society can survive a season of obedience, but it cannot build a future on it. Pressure finds a crack. In Romania, the crack widened in December 1989, and the force that came through it carried the regime away. Chapter 9. December 1989. Collapse of the dictator. By the end of the 1980s, the Romanian people had been hollowed out by hunger, cold, and silence. They had endured decades of fear, of lines for bread, of electricity cuts, of children dying in hospitals without medicine. They had endured endless speeches, portraits, and parades for a man who lived in a palace while they starved in apartments. The rage was silent but growing. The spark came in Timisoara on December 16, 1989. A Protestant pastor named Laszlo Tix had been a quiet critic of the regime. When authorities attempted to evict him, his parishioners gathered outside his home to protect him. The crowd grew. Slogans of support for Tix turned into slogans against Ceausescu. The Securitate and the army opened fire. Blood ran in the streets. Hundreds were killed. But instead of crushing the revolt, the killing spreaded. The news traveled fast. Timisoara became a symbol. In other cities, Romanians gathered, chanting, "Down with Ceausescu." The impossible had happened. The people had spoken out loud. On December 21, 1989, Ceausescu tried to stage a massive rally in Bucharest to show his strength. He appeared on the balcony of the Central Committee building, with state television broadcasting live. The crowd of tens of thousands had been carefully assembled, ordered to clap and cheer as always. He began to speak, but then something strange happened. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The chants faltered. Suddenly, boos and jeers broke out. For the first time in decades, the dictator heard open defiance. His face froze. Cameras captured the moment. He raised his hands, shouting, "Hello, hello," to quiet the crowd, but his voice trembled. The television broadcast cut off abruptly, but the damage was done. Millions of Romanians watching at home had witnessed the collapse of the spell. The dictator was no longer feared. The next day, December 22nd, Bucharest erupted. Barricades were built. Tanks rolled through the streets. The army fractured. Some units fought protesters. Others joined them. Snipers fired from rooftops, sowing terror. Smoke filled the air as thousands fought for their lives. By evening, Ceausescu realized the end had come. He and Elena fled by helicopter from the roof of the party headquarters. Their escape did not last long. Pilots, confused and terrified, landed the helicopter in the countryside. The couple tried to escape by car, but they were captured by the army. The man who had ruled Romania for 24 years, who had built himself into a god, was now a prisoner. In less than a week, his empire of terror had collapsed into dust. Chapter 10. Trial and Execution. On December 25, 1989, Nicolae and Elena Ceausescu were brought before a hastily assembled military tribunal. The trial was short, chaotic, and brutal. They were charged with genocide, with destroying the economy, with ordering the killing of thousands, with crimes against the people. Evidence was presented quickly. Famine statistics, executions, the dead of Timisoara. The prosecutors accused them of starving millions, of torturing dissenters, of bankrupting the nation while building their palace. The couple shouted defiance. Nicolae refused to recognize the court, calling it illegal. Elena cursed the judges. They denied everything. They sang the Internationale, the communist anthem, as if clinging to ideology could erase the blood on their hands. The trial lasted less than an hour. The verdict was preordained: guilty, sentence, death. They were dragged into a courtyard, shoved against a wall. Soldiers formed a firing squad. The cameras rolled. Nicolae Ceausescu, the genius of the Carpathians, screamed that history would remember him. Elena shouted obscenities. The soldiers opened fire. Bullets tore into their bodies. In seconds, the dictator and his wife were dead, riddled with dozens of rounds. Their blood stained the snow. The footage was broadcast to the world. For Romanians, it was a moment of release, a violent catharsis after decades of fear. The two figures who had loomed over their lives for a quarter of a century were gone in a spray of bullets. But their deaths did not bring back the dead. It did not erase the scars of hunger or the memories of torture. It did not undo the wasted lives, the broken families, the lost children. The execution was an ending, but also the beginning of a long reckoning. Chapter 11. Aftermath of a dictatorship. The revolution left over 1,100 people dead and more than 3,000 wounded. Most of them were civilians, shot in the streets during the chaos of December 1989. Families buried their children, their husbands, their wives. The joy of freedom was mingled with mourning. Romania erupted in celebration when news of the Ceausescu's deaths spread. Crowds danced, sang, burned portraits, tore down statues. Propaganda books were shredded and used as kindling. For the first time in decades, Romanians could shout in public without fear, but the hangover came quickly. The archives of the Securitate revealed the full extent of surveillance. Files documented betrayals, neighbors informing on neighbors, husbands on wives, children on parents. Trust had been poisoned. Families learned that those closest to them had been forced or persuaded to betray them. The country was traumatized by the realization that the Securitate's tentacles had reached into every corner of life. The economy was in ruins. Infrastructure was crumbling. Hospitals were barren. Orphanages were overflowing. Romania had to rebuild everything from scratch, not only institutions, but also trust. The House of the People still stood, a grotesque monument to megalomania. While people had starved, marble and chandeliers had been poured into the dictator's palace. The contrast became a symbol of the nightmare Romanians had lived through. Trials of former officials began, but many escaped justice. Former Securitate officers melted into new institutions. Old habits of corruption lingered. The wounds were too deep to heal quickly. The revolution was not a clean break. It was a messy birth of freedom, soaked in blood.